in terms of a price action. So the kind of brackets that we're dealing with is in the price action is this type of scenario here. Okay, so obviously at this point here we've got the ECB rate decision. Okay, so we've got ECB rates. Okay, everybody see what we're talking about. So the ECB rate decision is at this point on each of these boxes. This price here is, of course, the euro. Okay, so this price line is the euro dollar in 3 different scenarios. The forecast is for 25 basis points. However, that's 80%. And basically the 50 basis points makes up pretty much the rest of the narrative, right? 50 basis points is 20%. Okay. So when we see that, there's obviously a lot of scenarios. There's a lot of scenarios that we can start thinking about as possible plays here. If the euro is very soft, we've got scenario 1, which is a 25 basis point hike. Now, obviously, the idea of knowing where the euro's trading is very, very important to these scenarios developing, right? Because if we don't know where the euro's trading, the answer is going to be different because it's already priced in elements. That's why we can't just come up with a matrix and say that's what the matrix is. You know, it's always a great scenario building exercise, but we still don't know what's going to happen because we still don't know what's been priced in until, you know, the minutes before ultimately the data comes out. Now we can see the general idea about what's been priced in and we can make a decision on that. So obviously if the euro's down here and we now deal with scenario 1, what do you think the euro is going to do? Well, if you're dealing with scenario 1, it's 80% certain that it's 25, and it's 20% certain it's 50, and it comes out as 25, because that's ultimately the answer, wasn't it? It came out as 25. Because the euro's already gone in a discount phase here, I think the euro's probably going to run relatively flat now, isn't it? Yeah? Because it obviously has dropped off because it's been priced in. Yeah? So when we think about that, if it was 50 basis points, what do you think would happen to the euro in that case? Well, because they've actually sold the euro, there's a very good chance of a very big rise in the euro, right? A very big rise in the euro at that stage, right? Scenario 2 would give you a big, big, big upside. In scenario 2, the market's got an 80% price in of the 80. The euro's gone nowhere, and a 20% chance of a 50. So you'd imagine that in scenario 1, that they're going to be a little bit disappointed. Yeah, they're going to be a little bit disappointed in scenario 1 because obviously you're taking out the 20%, 50 basis points, correct? In scenario 2, of course, they're going to be, you know, nice and excited. Not as excited as the last one because obviously the last one had already priced in a poor response, but you get a very big response. So you get an upside move. So we'll kind of make it bullish, but we wouldn't make it as bullish as scenario 1. What about the third scenario inside of scenario 1? So what about C in scenario 1? If we get 25 basis points, this looks like a lot of traders on the euro are very, very optimistic about that 50 happening, right? A lot of traders are optimistic about the 50 happening. Why is the euro so hard at that stage? So the possibility is you're going to get a fairly reasonable sell-off on that, isn't it? And you can see that obviously the 50 basis points, you'd see some upside there. So what's important when we look at this is we start to recognize that the 3 scenarios have all different types of outcomes. If we think that the 25 is almost definite, are any of the outcomes bullish? Are any of these outcomes bullish if 25 happens? Yeah. So in scenario A, we might get a bit of a sideways action. But pretty much on the other scenarios, we're probably going to see some selling coming in, right? So we're going to see some selling coming in the euro. Well, where were we on the euro in terms of that box? Where were we in terms of that box, guys? Well, if this is the box here, would we all agree that that's a nice looking kind of Darvis box area there? Yeah? If that's the Darvis box kind of concept there, can we agree that we are probably in the Darvis box here at this point here? Is that a reasonable box trade idea concept to kind of think about there? You could draw the box anywhere and you're still going to get a top right hand price, aren't you? You're still going to get a top right hand price, agreed? So inside that box scenario, you're thinking to yourself, well, what is the most realistic scenario that I'm seeing in terms of a location? What is the scenario that I'm thinking of? Well, would it be reasonable for me to now consider that it's scenario number C, scenario letter C? So in scenario letter C, with an 80% probability, do you not think with an 80% probability, because it's an 80% probability we're going to get 25 basis points, right? So therefore, with an 80% probability, you think that the price is going to fall. Is that a reasonable conclusion from that narrative? Is that a reasonable thing to think? With an 80% probability, you think the price is going to fall. When do you often get presented with 80% odds on something? When do you often get that type of payoff with an 80% probability? Because you can see that the probability payoff on the other two scenarios is about right according to the odds, right? Because this is the big winner here, isn't it? That's only got a 20% probability, hasn't it? And this outcome here has still only got a 20% probability here as well, hasn't it? So the big outcomes only have 20% probabilities. But in this scenario here, the big outcome has an 80% probability. Is that not how to develop out your scenarios? Does that not make an awful lot of sense about these narratives going forward? Is that not the way you should always be thinking about the markets in terms of pricing in mechanisms? Because we know these numbers, because these aren't our numbers. We're not guessing at these numbers. These are the actual pricing numbers, aren't they? These are the actual pricing numbers. They're not our numbers. They're not anybody else's. These are our pricing numbers. We've got an 80% probability of 25 basis points. So therefore, we have a very, very big payoff. Now, we only know that when the price got to the high price. Because if it wasn't at the high price, this probably isn't much for us to work with, is it? If it was in the middle prices, we still had an 80% probability with probably a 50-50 payoff, yeah? Probably a 50-50 payoff on this one with an 80% probability. So that's not a bad payoff with an 80% probability. But on this one, there's no chance that I'm going to trade this, right? If the euro's already dropped, there's no way I'm going to trade this, correct? Because my payoff has got such a low probability, it doesn't make any sense. If you're really high probability stuff, if you want to trade the high probability stuff, this trade doesn't offer you any real edges, this one. So if this trade here doesn't offer you any real edges, what are you going to do about it? You're going to dismiss this. You might consider this, but you're definitely doing this trade here. Definitely doing this trade. Well, that's the trade that's set up before the numbers. And it was obviously just on the numbers that you got the opportunity to take that trade into your books. And obviously the sell-off turned out to be pretty good. Does that make sense, guys? Is that all good? Are you happy with that outcome? Are you happy with that idea, that narrative, that storyline? Because obviously it's important that we see this. It's important we understand this. And can you see why there was a fresh year top edge? Because when you think about it, who's stupid enough to buy that? Honestly, who's stupid enough to buy that 80% probability, that 80% probability sell? So in other words, they're manipulating it because they need to get rid of the sellers, don't they? They need to get rid of as many sellers as they can, because this has now got an 80% probability of a drop here. And a good drop at that, right? You see that? Just getting the US numbers coming out now as well, guys.